Session 4 will take us to Indonesia, gearing up for 2019 presidential elections. Moderating this session will be Dr. Leonard Sebastian, Associate Professor and Coordinator of Indonesia Program at the S. Rajaratnam School of International Studies, Nanyang Technological University. Dr. Sebastian, please.
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Such a pleasure to see all of you here. Such a pleasure, especially to be invited by ISIS to be able to moderate this session on Indonesia. As you will recall, I participated in the inaugural Regional Outlook Forum back in 1998. If I recall correctly, it was January 16, 1998. And I was always thankful to ISIS for giving me a wonderful platform to launch my career. And in that regard, when we reflect on 1998, it's always interesting to see how we make comparisons with 1998 and 20 years since 2018. A lot can happen in a 20-year period. And what is interesting with Indonesia is that Indonesia really didn't go through a revolution, it went through reformasi. So that meant a lot of changes in terms of changes to the political system, new political laws enshrining political freedoms, new institutions put in place in order to implement democratic norms, a new constitution put together, the military removed from an overt political role, and of course, decentralization as well, changing the trajectory of the country tremendously. Of course, back in 1998, we were always concerned about the potential for Indonesia to break up. Democracy in Indonesia has been extremely resilient, and we're very pleased for it, but Indonesia still remains a work in progress. So much change has taken place, but also 20 years has allowed for new democratic processes to be embedded in the system. New groups are emerging, new movements are emerging that were fledgling movements back in 1998 and much stronger now. And of course, it is a very, very young electorate as well. So in a sense, Indonesia is poised for a very interesting transformation going forward, especially as we see all these new leaders empowered by decentralization, like President Jokowi, making their mark in Indonesia. So we have a lot to actually try to learn and understand in terms of developing our understanding on Indonesia, and I'm really pleased and grateful that ISIS were able to attract such wonderfully talented speakers to join us here today. Bapak Andy Bayuni is the doyen of the media industry. He's written so many wonderful op-eds and has given such great editorial direction to the Jakarta Post. Bapak James Castle, who founded Castle Asia, has also been a very important point of reference for us in terms of understanding the trajectory of reformasi. So it's with great pleasure that I invite both of them to lead us off in this session on Indonesia as we look at the presidential election in 2019, but hopefully also try to understand the potential trajectories and future directions of Indonesia. Let me first invite Bapak Andy Bayuni to give his remarks. Bapak.
Thank you. Good afternoon all. And thank you, ECS, for inviting me to this prestigious annual conference. And thank you, Leonard, for making me feel old, calling me a doyen. Okay, we will have another exercise in democracy this year. This will be the 5th general elections that we will be holding since the collapse of the Suharto regime. And I would say Indonesia is probably one of the few successful story of democracy. We look at Thailand, so going back to military junta. We look at the Philippines. I think something's gone wrong there. We look at the Arab Spring. They didn't last very long. So for Indonesia to be holding on for 20 years, and we will have this election next year, I think something that many Indonesians don't know this, but I think we should be proud of the record. We've had 5 presidents taking turns since in the last 20 years, from Habibie, Gus Dur, and then we had Megawati, Yudhoyono, and Jokowi. So I think by now Indonesia is getting used to the idea of having change of leadership periodically. We retain Yudhoyono for the second term. I think that's also based on free and fair elections, more reflection of the popular will. We are now over from the era where one leader stays for almost forever. Sukarno stayed for 20 years. Suharto for almost 35 years. Those days are gone. But it's not just, well, I would say we have the electoral democracy in place, but more than that, besides the elections, we've had democracy and development for the last 20 years. The economy has been growing fantastically. The first 10 years of the millennial, I think we were growing by 7%. In the last 8 years, I think, have been growing by 5%. That's quite a good performance. And we have shown that democracy and development are compatible. It's not a question of choice of either you have democracy or development. That was the Suharto model. We had development, but not so much democracy. And on top of that, we have all kinds of freedoms. And one of them, the important, is the freedom of expression, and of course the freedom of the press. I'm reflecting my own bias. But I think this is important when it comes to the elections, because all the elections that we have had since 1999, so 2004, 2009, 2014, I would say that they have been based on, the outcome has been based on informed choices. And that's because of the press freedom. We were allowed to report on the candidates, the track records, the vision, the backgrounds, the characters. And so all the elections that we have had were based on informed choices and I would say rational outcome. So coming to this election this year, on April 17, the tendency for us is to focus at the presidential race, but there are other elections that are actually equally important. But of course, our main focus has always been on the presidential election. So we will be voting for president and the vice president, but on top of that, we'll be voting for representatives in the House of Representatives, and then in the regional council, the Senate, and then we will also be voting for the provincial and district or majority level councils. In all, there will be more than 20,000 seats up for grabs. That's quite a lot. And actually, there are more than 200,000 people running for the elections. And they will be spending lots of money on the campaign and vote buying. So it's always the tendency during the elections, the business people, like Jim Castle's clients, they are withholding investment. But I think the investment is coming from politicians spending so much money for the election campaign. Of course, most of them would realize afterwards it was bad investment, but they do it anyway. Altogether, there will be more than 190 million voters. That's quite a large number to organize, and there will be 800,000 polling stations. I volunteered to run my local polling stations because I want to see democracy at the local level. I did that in the 2017 Jakarta elections. It was quite an amazing experience, and I volunteered to do it again in my local polling stations in April. So that's just the opening, giving the picture of the elections. Now, what's the difference between this year's elections and the one that we had in 2014? Given that the candidates for the presidential race are the same, we have Jokowi running against General Prabowo. But as I can tell you, that it will be a very different elections from what we had 5 years ago. The outcome may be the same, but I think the process will be very different because the dynamics will be very different. Number one, it's the position of Jokowi as the incumbent against Prabowo as the challenger. In 2014, they were both just coming into the race. Neither had any track records in government. And then number two, I think the coalition of political parties supporting the candidates are also very different. That's going to have an impact in the process of the elections. And of course, they each have different running mates this time. And then the fourth difference will be the issues that will be discussed in the campaign. And I think the fifth element is that the fact that this will be simultaneous elections. In 2014, the elections, we had the legislative elections first, and then 3 months later, we would have the presidential election. They've decided this is a wasting of lots of money. They decided to make it simpler so that we have one election, all the election in one day. This probably has no direct consequence on the presidential race, but I think has consequences on the legislative elections. I will explain that later. So first, the nature of the incumbent and the challenger. Joko Widodo comes into the race with 5 years of track records, and I think any incumbent will have that advantage. And I would say that his track record in the last 5 years have been good, not great, and not disaster either. And I think, many of the surveys indicate that people are happy with his performance, are more likely that they're going to give their votes to him. The same way that they were happy with Yudhoyono in the first term, and then they gave him a landslide victory in 2009. I'm not sure if it's going to be a landslide again, but I think all the surveys indicate that he has a massive lead over Prabowo. So the nature of the campaign will be very different. Being the incumbent, he will be listing all the success, all the achievements he has made, and it's quite a lot. I think in terms of the economic deliveries, he has done a lot. Social policies, and many others. And the challenger will be poking at some of the flaws, the shortcomings of the current president. So that's the nature of the campaign will be different from what we had in 5 years ago. The supporting coalition, this time around, Jokowi commands the support of 9 political parties, including the 2 biggest winners in 2014, Golkar and PDIP. So he's got a lot of big support, and then he's also counting on the support of 2 of the Islamist parties, and a few other nationalist parties. In contrast, this time around, Prabowo only has the support of 4 or 5 political parties, his own parties, the party of President Yudhoyono, former President Yudhoyono, and one of the Islamist parties. So again, this means that Jokowi, the incumbent, has the advantage because he has the political machinery, the political parties that will be mobilizing and campaigning on his behalf for the election. Running mates, another interesting point to notice is that Jokowi's running mate is the #1 ulama in the country, Ma'ruf Amin. He is the chairman of the Ulama Council. That makes him the top ulama in the country. It was not his choice. It was not his first choice. It was actually imposed by the coalition. But I think it worked well in terms of eliminating Islam from the election campaign teams. You may recall in 2014, Islam was a factor. There was a lot of campaign trying to discredit or question the religiosity of President Jokowi. Islam again became a big factor during the Jakarta governor elections. And the incumbent, he was Basuki Cahayapurnama. He was Christian and he's Chinese, a double minority. So they used religion and race very effectively, and then the incumbent lost the election. There were fears earlier that this would be replicated in the presidential race. But I think the fact that when they found out that Jokowi's running mate is the #1 ulama, they said that it's not worth it because you cannot attack the #1 ulama in the country. So Islam is basically off the menu in the presidential race, but not necessarily in the legislative elections because there are still Islamist parties that are campaigning for Islamic State, for the Sharia, and they will use that to win votes. Issues, like I said, Islam is not going to be the big factor, or not even a factor in the presidential race. So this, which is good, because there were fears that if they use Islam again, it's going to be very divisive, divide the country along religious lines, and make people very uncomfortable. We had that in 2017 during the Jakarta race. So people felt, the Muslims and non-Muslims felt uncomfortable. This time, Islam is not going to be a factor in the presidential race, and so this basically leaves the challenger Prabowo to look at the economic performance. Like I said, Jokowi's economic performance was not stellar. There were holes, there were flaws. For example, the question of the budget deficit, the trade deficit, the weakening of the rupiah, the gap between the rich and the poor, and the large number of unemployed, educated unemployed, college graduates without jobs. The unemployment level is actually lower, but I think we look at the composition. There's a big problem among the young people who are not happy that the economic growth has not delivered them the jobs that they need. So these are the issues that have emerged in the election campaigns, not so much by Prabowo, but I think more by his running mate, Sandiaga Uno, who's actually a self-made billionaire, very articulate and young. So he appeals to the young people, and he also appeals to the business community, and he appeals to housewives. He's been campaigning in markets and talking to housewives about asking about the prices of commodities and basically listening to what the complaints. So, given all that, the question is who's going to win the election? I consulted my crystal ball this morning. It was hazy. I cannot see it. But like I said, all the surveys indicate Jokowi is so far ahead. He leads by about 30% margin, 20-something for Prabowo against 50-something voting for Jokowi. But that means about 20%, 15 to 20% of people are still undecided or don't know. And that could tip the balance during the election day. So although people are saying that Jokowi is going to win the election, there is that possibility that those who are undecided could just decide and cast their votes to Prabowo. We could be in for a surprise. I mean, if it happened, Donald Trump, Brexit, it can happen in Indonesia too. So we should be prepared. But the election itself, the question is, there are indications that there may be violence, but there was always indications that the election will be violence. But looking at all the elections we have had since 1999, none of them turned violent. So we don't have a history of electoral violence. And I think that's good. So going to the race in this year's race, with that record, I think we feel quite comfortable. It doesn't mean that the campaign are not brutal. Actually, they're very brutal. They use harsh words, they use threats, intimidations. And they waged a lot of the campaign through the social media and a lot of fake news and hoaxes used by both camps, I have to say. But the one that's triggered an investigation by the police last week was when there was a campaign to try to discredit the Electoral Commission. Basically, they're saying that there have been ballot boxes found in Tanjung Priok port, 7 boxes, and they said they were shipped from China. And all the ballot papers have already been casted and, of course, given to Jokowi. This was, of course, is fake. But because it went viral, I think the police decided to investigate. Of course, it's all fake. But the idea is that, I think behind that is trying to discredit the Electoral Commission so that the loser can say that, look, it's all cheat, and we are not going to accept this election. I think in 2014, there was an attempt also to try to discredit the Election Commission and hence the electoral process. But the threat of violence that, we're not going to accept this election because it's all rigged and we're going to rebel, it didn't happen. It could have happened, but I think it was a time when I think Prabowo decided to just accept the election at the very last minute. Okay, now let me go back to the question of the simultaneous elections. Like I said, it's not going to affect the presidential race, but it's going to affect the composition of the outcome of the legislative race. There are 16 political parties contesting the national election, and there are 4 parties contesting in Aceh. Aceh is a special area because of the past history of rebellion, so they are allowed to have local, regional political parties in Aceh contesting the election for seats in Aceh. Now, what's going to happen on April 17 is that people will be going to the polling booth with 4 or 5 ballot papers. One is going to be the ballot for president and vice president, and then the second one is for the representatives in the House. Third one is in the Senate, and then the fourth one will be the local, provincial, or city council. In some areas, in all areas except Jakarta, they have the second one because they have province and then district and mayor representatives. So in 2014 and in the previous elections, we were voting for the legislators first, right? So we forget about the presidential election for now. We just vote for, so they can focus on that. This time around, they are given the menu, vote for your president and your representatives in the different councils. And that's going to affect the way people cast their votes because there will be a kind of bandwagoning effect. That, the parties that support Jokowi, the major parties that support Jokowi, that means PDIP, will get the benefit because people will say that I'm going to vote for Jokowi and his party is PDIP, I'm going to give the vote to that party and the local councils. I think Gerindra, Prabowo's party, will also get the benefit of the bandwagon effect. People who will vote for Prabowo will decide that they will cast the votes for members from Gerindra. And so, and many surveys already indicated that many of the big parties, or many of the medium and big parties, will not even make it to the threshold. Golkar, which had been the top 2 parties since post-Suharto era, may drop to number 3, and they're fighting hard to retain their position. And PKS being the main Islamist parties, all surveys indicate they will not make the threshold of 4% of the national votes to be able to be represented in the House. I think many surveys indicate only 5 political parties out of 16 will make the threshold and get representation in the House. Now, just looking forward, I think the implications for the next government after the election is that the president, we have a presidential system, but we still have to have a coalition government because under the arrangement in post-Suharto era, the president does not have all the powers to himself, and he has to share with parliament. And there is a balance. Well, I think the president has most of the power, but I think the parliament or the House of Representatives has some power to veto, to deny the president's, at least his legislative agenda. So this has been consistent under Yudhoyono and under Jokowi, that he has to manage a coalition of political parties in the government. And now, if we're going to see only 5 political parties making the threshold, that means it's going to simplify the political system. At the moment, we have 10 political parties represented in Parliament. Maybe in October, when they inaugurate the new House, we may end up with only 5 or 6 political parties. In a way, it's good because that means it's going to simplify the political system. But I think in terms of governance, the next president may be leading a smaller coalition, but I think this coalition will be demanding a lot from the new president, whether it's Jokowi or Prabowo. Kind of payback, I supported you in the elections, and therefore they will have a long list of demands, usually cabinet positions, of course, and some project that they dear to them. So it's going to be an interesting year for Indonesia. It's going to be very different from what we had in 2019. The outcome may be the same, but I think the process will be different, and the governance beyond after the election may also be different. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Pak Andi. Excellent presentation. James, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Leonard, and good afternoon, everyone. It's always a pleasure to be here, and thank you, ISIS, for the invitation, and always a pleasure to share the panel with my good friend Andy. Because it's a little late in the afternoon, I have a presentation. I thought maybe some color would help more than listening to me. And I thought there's not much space between Andy and I in the way that we see things developing. So what I thought I might do is first learn how to use this, is take a quick look at the economy, because the economy is, the two candidates have chosen to argue about the economy. That's basically the main campaign issue. The sectarian issues are being downplayed by the principal candidates, although they do play a role in other areas. But if we look a little bit at the economy, and there's actually a broad consensus, and maybe a disturbing consensus on the direction the economy ought to go. A deeper look at the political party structure, because as Andy indicated, the new features of this election have a different meaning for Indonesia's democratic future. And there's also a surprisingly broad agreement amongst the political elite on the range of policy options. I also want to give you a little flavor of the political dialogue and what it all might mean for the next few years. So just quickly, from a business point of view, this is what we talk about in the economy. Basically, the macro management has been quite good over the last several years. In general, really over the last decade, it's been reasonably good. And even at 4 to 5% growth, there are a lot of opportunities, particularly in infrastructure investment is $30 billion a year. There are other areas in the consumer market. For investors, the liquid financial markets offer more safety and better returns than long-term FDI because of the higher risk. But the growing middle class offers the prospect of steady growth, as well as continued support for the democratic process and constructive participation in public life. The challenge really is to provide greater opportunities for low-income groups at the current growth levels, because 5% really is not enough. And the failure to do so could undermine the political stability necessary for continued growth and greater prosperity. So just look at GDP growth, and I think this is important because we see reasonable recovery in the first SBY period. Then commodity prices went down, the global financial crisis came in, and we saw a steady downhill trajectory for Indonesian growth under the second SBY period. Part of this was due to the global situation. Another part was due to domestic policy directives, which we'll talk more about in a few minutes. Jokowi campaigned on bringing growth back to 7%. He's failed to do that. He's stabilized growth around 5%, but again, he has been not able to move any further up the chain. We talk about inflation. Indonesia is a reasonably high inflation country, and another success in the Jokowi era has been to keep inflation down well below 5%, high by many standards, but low by Indonesian historical standards. And of course, the rupiah has been highly volatile, as all emerging market currencies have been the last 18 to 24 months. Again, it seems to have stabilized now, and that's more dependent on what happens in the U.S. with the U.S. Fed. But we think in the business community we can hold the rupiah around 14,500 to 15,000 over the next year or so. An underlying problem, why is Indonesia stuck at 5%? Because the bottom line is Indonesia is out of money. I say that because they're spending all the money they have. They're spending it quite well, actually. The budget is less than 3% of GDP. The current account deficit is less than 3% of GDP. They're spending the money well, but they don't have any more. And they've been unable to attract foreign investment. They've been unable to attract money for public-private partnerships for infrastructure. And this is the direct result of Indonesian policy decisions which they made for nationalist reasons. But if you look at this chart here, you can see in terms of domestic liquidity, Indonesia is much lower than some other emerging markets, India, Mexico, et cetera, down there with about Russia. If you look at the next slide, this is the domestic bond market in comparison with some other ASEAN countries. You can see that domestic finance is relatively low and very tight in Indonesia, which means you have to borrow foreign currency to grow, which means you end up with a foreign exchange risk, which if not well managed, you end up with a version of the Asian financial crisis that many of us suffered through in 1997 and 98. So Indonesia is really hamstrung, or constrained, I should say, by its inability to raise long-term finance, direct and indirect investment. As a result, this is the latest World Bank Economic Quarterly Report. Indonesia's productivity is lagging behind its ASEAN peers. And as you can see, in the last several years, Indonesia has increased its trade barriers significantly more than other ASEAN neighbors. This is a political decision. This is a political reform. Indonesia has decided consciously and deliberately to look inward. When we talk about economic reform, we'll talk a little bit about the World Bank objectives in a few minutes, but basically Indonesia has decided to look inward and do it itself. And this, again, inhibits its ability to attract international finance to support its economic growth. As a result, as well, manufacturing competitiveness has been flat compared to the ASEAN neighbors. It punches below its weight in attracting FDI. You can see it's the lowest level as a percent of GDP among the ASEAN countries. And if you listen to the political dialogue in Indonesia, Indonesia has too much foreign investment. This has been the constant political theme for the last decade. Many of you probably follow the Freeport mining case. So Indonesia has just taken 51% of Freeport. This is considered a nationalist victory. It also has taken $4 billion of foreign investment out of the country. So the desire to take over the natural resource sector, the successful acquisition of 50% of Freeport, the takeover of Newmont by domestic investors, another mining interest of about $2 billion, financed by state banks, the takeover of the Chevron Mahakam Rokan gas block, another $10 to $15 billion in foreign investment that won't materialize, the takeover of the Mahakam gas field from Total and Inpex, another $2 billion of foreign investment that has to be replaced by domestic investment. Not to say they're not good investments, not to say it's not, they were all done fairly and under Indonesian law and under the contracts, but this takes $10 to $20 billion of foreign investment out of the country at a time the country is strapped for liquidity. So they're paying a very high price for their inward-looking nationalist goals. And this is neither political party or neither candidate is contesting this. Furthermore, with the growth they've had, there's an acute shortage of human resources, and yet overseas workers have become a smaller and smaller part of the picture. And if you read, this is the latest data from the World Bank and the Department of Manpower. The biggest growth has come in Chinese workers, and these are literally turnkey projects where all levels of Chinese employees or workers are brought in to work on infrastructure projects financed by the Chinese. So if you take that out of the picture, really professional and technical, highly skilled technical people have actually dropped in a growing economy with a small education base given the size of the economy. So it's all very inward looking. So this, the World Bank, the December Economic Quarterly, just spend a few minutes on this, reducing import tariffs, implementing ambitious free trade agreements, et cetera, et cetera. You can read all of these for yourself. Obviously, Indonesia is not alone in looking inward. The point I want to make is this is not new in Indonesia. This has been going on. This is the theme of reformasi. When we talk about reforms and we think of the neoliberal reforms of the late Suharto era, basically the policy pretty consistently in Indonesia for the last 20 years, accelerating in the second SBY period and continuing under this government, has been to reduce the space for foreign investors and be more self-sufficient. And this is a constant policy, a conscious policy without debate, and no significant political or social force in Indonesia is criticizing this. So when we talk about the reforms for the World Bank, that the World Bank has proposed, basically virtually every political party is campaigning against this kind of opening. So the chances of it happening are, I think, pretty close to zero. I think we have to be frank, and as business people, we have to understand the political landscape and see what's really possible and where democratic Indonesia wants to go. And they're willing to sacrifice growth for a more domestically oriented economy. You can argue about it if you want, but the political consensus is there. I won't spend too much time on this part of the political parties, but as Andy indicated, this is a make or break year for many parties because of the new 4% threshold. So only 4 parties are, in other words, you have to win at least 4% of the seats to qualify for parliament. And so only 4 parties are really virtually assured of getting in. Several, including some of the old established parties, P-Tiga, one of the 3P party, I should say, PAN and PKS, are all really going to have to struggle to get into parliament. And there's a very interesting dynamic, but let's talk a little bit about what the candidates are saying. They've both agreed not to talk about sectarian issues. And so you can read this for yourself. But pluralism is Indonesia's DNA. This is Jokowi. Islam in Indonesia has always been peaceful and tolerant. Nothing will change that. No group will be allowed to threaten Indonesia's peace and harmony. Prabowo, who is more supported by the conservative Muslims, not because he's a particular religious leader, he isn't. He's a general. He doesn't have strong religious credentials in that regard, but they really don't like Jokowi for a variety of reasons. So, but Prabowo himself has, unlike in the Jakarta election campaign, Prabowo has chosen not to make that an issue. And he says, if I'm elected and accept the mandate, I understand I must be a leader for all cultures, religious, races, and ethnic groups. So that's all very much in the positive. The Gurinder strategy is all about the economy. Economic growth will drive the campaign. This is all a positive. But the populism is very strong, and this is where Prabowo distinguishes himself certainly from Jokowi. He attacks the Jakarta elite and the global elite. They're mental mauling, which is basically intellectual criminals. I see the faces of the Jakarta elite are full of tricks. The trickle-down theory is a lie. Prosperity does not drip down. On the contrary, it is taken overseas by the elite. Nah, the big question, who is that elite? The elite is the leadership, Prabowo says. I'm also the elite. The difference is I'm one who is aware, I am repentant, and I am faithful. So basically, he's making it an election on his character. And then more recently, he said, if Gerindra loses the election, the country could be exterminated. So he is given to hyperbole, but he's driven to this corner because basically their campaigns are the same. And it's hard to say he's more nationalistic in the economy than Jokowi because of the takeover of foreign investment, as I've mentioned, but also Jokowi has implemented a very successful, very popular national health care program. He has a conditional cash transfer program. So he's really responded in areas where previous governments have been all talk and no action. So it's really, in the first campaign in 2014, Jokowi was unknown at this level, as was Prabowo. So they could argue and you could pick who you liked, and by a 53 to 47 margin, they picked Jokowi. But over 5 years, Jokowi has really burnished his nationalist credentials. So this is why Prabowo's campaign is really kind of cornered, and he's having difficulty distinguishing himself. Just to give you a little more flavor, this is a poem, which is popular in certain circles. This is read by a 3-star general with presidential aspirations at a Gold Card national meeting a year and a half ago. The poem is, "But It's Not Ours." These are just a few of the stanzas. Look at life in the Desa, such fertile soil, such broad rice fields, but they're not ours. Look at city life, orderly supermarkets, lively marketplaces, but they're not ours. Look at all the goods people are buying and selling. Oh, prosperity, but it's not ours. I ask you the question, if it doesn't belong to the Gold Card leadership and 4-star and 3-star generals, who does it belong to? But this is a feeling of grievance. It's a feeling of grievance that drives the elite. You can call it a colonial hangover. You can call it whatever you want, but it's just a fact. It drives a lot of the policies, this inward-looking policy that, and from my view, as a card-carrying neoliberal who's globally in disfavor, I think they're expensive. And I think the mistake is no one's doing the numbers and analyzing how much this is costing the country. But I don't see it changing because no names to be mentioned, but some of the most liberal economists in Indonesia are silenced. They're not intimidated they can say what they want, but they've bought into it. They don't stand up to it. This is really where we're going. So all I say, this is from a business point of view, when we lobby for reforms and we talk to business communities, this is what you get. Don't expect the other. It still is 5% growth. This is good. Is it enough? I don't know. I hope so, because I think that's all we're going to get. So I'll just wrap up by saying that I think we really have to respect the democratic process in Indonesia. There has been reformasi. There has been a very bold reform program. It hasn't worked in other countries. It's working marginally well in Indonesia now. It may work well in the future. We'll just have to wait and see. But until other voices emerge in a more liberal economic viewpoint, this is what we get. And in fact, the only challenge to this philosophy is conservative sectarian religion. And they want the country closed for different reasons. But the dialogue between the two, if these two poles make a consensus, what we're still going to get is a more closed economy, not a more open economy. So this is the concern that, to me, if they don't provide the growth necessary to keep stability, to improve education, healthcare, and everything we know is so important. where the indicators have flatlined after some reasonable success. This is the concern we have for the future. So I think this has to be the dialogue we try and open up and see if with neoliberal institutions like the World Bank and so on, if we can push towards a more open economy. Jokowi has tried some liberalization. At his heart, he's a small businessman. I'm a small businessman. We think a lot alike on a lot of issues. But every time he's tried his reforms, he backs off at the first smell of gunfire. In October, he was going to raise the fuel price a little bit to cut down the deficit. He backed off within hours. Then, after 6 months of review in December, they announced a contraction of the negative investment list. They were going to open up more areas to foreign investment. They spent 6 months working on this. They put it out. Within 1 week, they abandoned it because of criticism from certain members of the Indonesian Chamber of Commerce. They felt it was too liberal. Now, my point is, why wasn't that discussed before they announced the reforms if they were so sensitive and were so little commitment to them? Why did they do it? So right now, within the government, there's not a commitment to some of these reforms. There's talk about it. We see a few very timid reform packages, but there's no reason for optimism in this regard. And with this, I think Indonesia will continue to grow at around 5%, but it's going to be fragile growth, not robust growth, and we're going to have to struggle forward. And the big challenge, and I'll leave this with as an unanswered question, is we saw the 212 movement, the sectarian movement. We saw 500,000 people, plus or minus, demonstrate in Jakarta on the 3rd anniversary, December 2nd. Conservative Islamic figures. These people are outside the formal political structure. They have no political home. If they find a political home, or if they find a charismatic leader, or their version of Jokowi, who's a charismatic Javanese leader, then they will become a political force by 2024. And if the economy continues to grow at no more than 5%, God forbid it grows at less, there will be social issues that will come up, and their message will be more attractive. So this is the concern I have going forward. We can make it, we're doing okay, but there's plenty to worry about. And so at that point, I'll say, keep worrying, work hard, and hope for the best. Thank you.
Very interesting. Thank you, James. In reality, I think what we have to ask our panelists to discuss is really the nature of the economy. Is the economy a benefit for Jokowi, or is the economy going to become his Achilles heel in the 2019 elections? But hold on to that thought first. Let me first invite some questions. Yes, Prof. Kishore. Yes. May I have one more question? Yes.
You'll have to help me with the questions. I can't hear.
Thank you. I want to congratulate both the presenters. But my question actually is for Andy. James Castle gave a very powerful presentation that basically showed that despite all the rhetoric, the Indonesian economy essentially hasn't opened up, doesn't look as though it's going to open up, even though the evidence shows very clearly that when countries open up, they do much better. I mean, this morning, we saw the presentation on Vietnam. It was spectacular, okay? To go from 20% of your GNP foreign trade to 200%. That's spectacular. And the evidence is clear. When you do that, you grow at 8-9%. So my question to you, Andy, is, one is, are there deeper cultural roots that explain the sort of economic insularity that James Castle described? And secondly, is there any possibility that President Jokowi, in his second term, his last term, with the advice of Sri Mulyani, may say, okay, this is my last term, I can now take risks, I will open up the economy more. Can that happen?
Yes, the question at the back.
Thank you, Prof. Augustine from Channel News Asia. Actually, both speakers, if I was to be cheeky, you kind of made an argument that it might be the first and the last term for Jokowi. Because, I mean, from the research that I did, and actually I wanted to compliment this research that was done by Dedi Denato from your school, Prof. Leonard. It's going to be a Twitter race. For Jokowi, a more comprehensive strategy to counterbalance the influence of the hashtag 2019 Change President will be important. Without such a strategy, the 2019 Change President movement may potentially sway enough voters to stop him from being re-elected. Singaporeans may not understand this, but the Twitter community in Indonesia is very big. So ever since I read this article from RSIS, I've been doing my research, and I must say it's fascinating. Building from the earlier session, that video that went viral, it's got 51 million views in Thailand. So what's your assessment? This is a country that has produced 4 unicorns, Gojek, Traveloka, Bukalapak, Tokopedia, and the projection is in 2019 there will be another 5 unicorns, $1 billion each. But is this the good work of the SBY administration, and Jokowi's administration is running basically on autopilot? And so there's a strong indication that you might just say, let's take the hashtag change president, which I went to check online, is also doing very well. And Pak Andy would probably follow this better than I do. I mean, there are national anthems that have been crafted and composed that are going out by Mardani Alisura and by Johnny Alang. These are all people who have crafted very interesting anthems. And if you go outside Jakarta, where the real Indonesia is, the sentiment on the ground is very different. Sometimes we get too Jakarta-centric. So my question for both analysts is, are we really seeing indicators, at least in the social media, Twitter-strong Indonesia, that it's time for change? Thank you.
Yes.
Liu Shizhong from Taiwan. Yes, my question is more about electoral tactics, because both of presenters haven't touched upon this issue of a disinformation campaign or fake news campaigns. We've seen that kind of a new type of a campaign going on in the US, France, Brazil, and in Taiwan, most recent local election in Taiwan. I was wondering whether it will be irrelevant to the upcoming election in Indonesia, or you think that could be some kind of a factor, determined factors? Thank you.
Thank you very much. Pak Andi, will you go first?
Can you, what's the last question again?
The last question is on the electoral tactics.
Okay.
You know, we've seen it used in other parts of the world. Will it be reflected in Indonesia?
Thank you. Let me address the question from Kishore. Whether there's a deep-seated cultural element in the way we look at the nationalization of foreign assets. I think what happened with Freeport was something that would have happened anyway under any president, because the contract was going to expire in 2021. They have to make a deal before 2019, 2 years before the contract expired. In fact, Freeport has been negotiating for much of the time during the Jokowi's presidency, back and forth. And I'm sure this would have happened under any president. In fact, under Yudhoyono, and then of course, Amin Rais has been the biggest proponent for what we call resource nationalism. I think people don't look, and I think Jim make a very good case about foreign investment leaving the country, but people don't look at it like this. I think the political culture is, these are our assets, we have to be in possession of them, and we have to manage them and get the most benefit out of it. This comes out from this perception that for decades, foreign investment has been taking advantage of Indonesia under Sukarno, definitely under Suharto, and there was this kind of a desire, I think, across all the political lines, that we, Indonesia, have to control our own natural resources, and that means Indonesians have to be owning it, not just leasing, but actually owning it. It happened with all the contracts. But as I think resource nationalism is probably fashionable, not just in Indonesia, in many countries in South America, in Africa. There is also that movement. So it's not exclusive to Indonesia. But the trend is not just happening under Jokowi, but it goes back even under Yudhoyono. There is this, I don't know, this is probably the legacy of being colonized by the Dutch for too long. And then there is always this suspicions about foreigners' intention to extract, the natural resources out of Indonesia and then leaving us in poverty. I think that perception is very much prevalent among politicians, even among the public. And therefore, we have this perception that we should be able to control and even own the assets, in spite of the fact that Jokowi has been traveling since the beginning of his presidency, going around saying that we give you the red carpet, come and invest in Indonesia. But of course, the reality is when they come to Indonesia, then they found out that the things are the bureaucracy makes it difficult. There is kind of they're talking two different languages. Jokowi is saying that we welcome investors. The bureaucracy is saying that, well, we just need your money, but anything else, just leave the country. We don't even need the workers. Of course, that's a lie, because Indonesia does not have many of the skills that are required to run many of the foreign investment projects. Jokowi, second term, if you look at Yudhoyono in second term, we had expected that he would build his legacy for something that, and then which the nation would remember. It didn't happen. When he was doing his second term, he was still polishing his image as if there was going to be a third term, although the Constitution bars him from running for a third term. But he was doing that all the time, and we were all frustrated that he could have done better in the second term and forget about popularity and do the right thing. He didn't do that. My hope is that I think Jokowi, with the right advice around people around him, that this is the opportunity for you to build a long-lasting legacy and don't follow on the footsteps of Yudhoyono. I don't know who's advising Jokowi, but that's my hope that's going to happen. The second question about the use of social media. I think the social media is going to be the place where almost all the election campaign will be waged, which is, in a way, is good. I see it as more positive than negative. Some people say it's bad, but I think there's more good than bad in the use of the internet and social media in waging the election campaign. Number one, I think it's reaching out to more people, and we get the feedback as well. The politicians will get the feedback from the people about what is it that they want. So that's the good side. The downside is, of course, the proliferation of fake news that could affect the outcome of the elections. But at the end of the day, I think it's people who make decisions. They may be affected by the hoax, by the fake news, and they would vote accordingly. But I like to give the benefit of the doubt to the people. I think they have learned, and everybody learned from they learn about fake news, about hoaxes in the 2014 elections. After that, people are starting to realize a lot of the campaigns were all fake. And I think people got smarter since then, and hopefully, again, in spite of the use of fake news again in 2019, my hope is that it's not going to affect the outcome of the election so much. Everybody's using it, by the way. So it's not just one camp, but on both sides, and everybody is doing that. And I would say it's a fair game. Of course, there are limits on, if the fake news is so bad, creating hatred, that's when the police have to step in. And I think they have done that to some extent. The last question, the technique used in USA, in France. Again, I think this goes back to populism. Indonesia is also populism, like many what we see around the world, and this is a consequence of the internet being now the primary tool to run elections. I'm sure they're going to replicate some of the methods or techniques used. In fact, I think both sides, I know they hire foreign consultants to help them with the election campaign. So yes, there will be some of the techniques used we've seen in Europe, in the States, being also used in Indonesia for that reason.
Well, first of all, I have to apologize. I have a hearing problem, so if I miss a lot of the nuances, I apologize, but I can't hear everything so clearly. So, but in terms of the social media, I hope I don't repeat too much of what Andy said, but basically, Prabowo got off to a better start this time than Jokowi with the, well, actually not Prabowo again, but the 212 forces with the Ganti president. That's not really a Prabowo initiative. And they were also behind, or strong part of the 212 demonstration, which was not a political event because it wasn't open to campaign. It couldn't be, we're outside the campaign period. Prabowo did appear, and all he said was, it's good to see everybody. It's not a campaign event, but I'm glad to see everybody out doing their thing. So he didn't try and take advantage of it. Jokowi wasn't invited, so that's political content, I suppose. In the last election, 2014, you may recall that a lot of the polls within a month of the election showed Prabowo moving ahead. And then the Jokowi millennial crowd really had a very effective social media campaign, which was one of the things that got him over the hump. Now, he won a substantial victory. I mean, 53 to 47 or 54 to 46, that's a pretty big electoral margin. But social media, he had a big advantage in 2014, in my view, which I think it's more an even level playing field now. Virtually, if you're on your WhatsApp, you're getting 3, 4, 5, 6, 10 campaign events every day, and some of them are pretty well done, pretty impressive. Maybe I'm on the wrong list, but I don't get the black stuff, and I don't know how much of that's around. But basically, I don't see any dark forces at work in this election. I see it as a pretty transparent, very democratic process. And maybe just a little anecdote. I was a poll watcher in the 1999 election and the 2004 election. And the 99 election was pretty exciting. I have to say, one of the most interesting things I've ever done, because nobody knew which way it would go. And I happened to be president of the American Chamber of Commerce at that time, and we got permission to form a poll watcher group. We were the 4th largest group in the country at that time. And really the democratic enthusiasm that we saw and the lack of manipulation. And it's a very transparent system. It's almost impossible to cheat on the count. Because what they do is they vote from 8 till 12, they close the poll for an hour, everybody sits around the polling station, then they open the boxes and count the votes in front of everybody. So you can't cheat at the local level. You can cheat up the line, but if they went back to do an audit, you couldn't cheat. Now, having said that, this is a tremendous logistical problem. In those elections, there were 5 million poll watchers. How many people in Singapore? Let's all get on the bus and go down and be a poll watcher. There's 100,000 voting booths, and some of them in very isolated areas. So it's a tremendous exercise. But really, having watched it now for so many elections, it's quite impressive, and is a real argument against electronic voting. And as an American, I am embarrassed. Why? Because if you watch an American election, you'll see polling lines out into the street, you know, as the polls close at 8 o'clock or 9 o'clock, whenever they close. There'll be 100 people waiting to vote. In Indonesia, the voting, the sections they have 500 to 1,000 voters. They can all vote in a few minutes, and everybody hangs around and votes. Nobody has to wait more than 5 minutes to vote. I mean, it's a tremendously open, transparent, democratic process. So I think These are the kind of things that whatever you think of the current candidates or policies, these are the things that have to be protected. These things are gold, and really it's something that makes one feel more confident about the future.
We have time for one final round of questions. Can I invite some questions? Yes, please.
Hi, Michelle Germisco from Bloomberg. This question is a bit more for James since you introduced the topic on FDI. I'm wondering, moving forward, either under Prabowo or Jokowi, how you think the more strict FDI might come about. Is that through policy changes on rules or also through acquisitions such as those that you mentioned or cancellation of projects or something else? Thank you.
What? Yell at me, I can't.
Rules relating to FDI. What would be the possibilities? Maybe I'll ask her to say it again.
Yeah.
Could you repeat your question again, please?
Yes, thank you. It's on FDI.
FDI, okay.
So how exactly would either Prabowo or Jokowi make those, curb those inflows? Would it be through whether the acquisitions that you mentioned more toward domestic entities or a cancellation of projects like infrastructure or some change in rules to just curb those inflows?
Okay, I'll do my best. Thank you.
So let's see whether anybody else, because we do have to close the session. Yes, Inche Zainal.
Thank you, Zainal here. We've heard a lot about Jokowi and Prabowo, but I wonder, I was told that in fact Indonesia is divided with this coming election. So I'd like to ask a question about the vice presidential candidates. What do you see in them? How much do they reflect the issues, the challenges, and the opportunities as far as democracy in Indonesia is concerned? Thank you.
Okay, that one I got. Vice presidents. I'm from America. We have vice presidents, and one esteemed congressman once said, when he was asked to be vice president, "It's not worth a warm cup of spit." So I have a distinctly cynical view. Well, they're a spare tire. They're there to go to the airport. However, we see in Indonesia, particularly maybe because of the personality rather than the office per se, the first directly elected vice president, of course, was Yusuf Kala. And if anyone knows Yusuf Kala, he is not one to sit quietly and watch the parade go by. He's a very active person, and he made a very active vice president to the extent he sometimes stepped on the toes of SPY and wasn't asked to continue. Then he was asked again by Jokowi, and Jokowi used him quite a bit in a number of areas. So it's a more active office in Indonesia, not by fiat, not by regulation, but by practice. So it does count a bit. Now, the interesting thing about this one is the contrast between an aging cleric, Maruf Amin, and a young dynamic businessman, Sandy Uno. And I think both are going to help the ticket because Jokowi is weak with conservative religious groups, Muslim groups. There's no denying that. And of course, Maruf is a very credible figure. I don't think I'm 73, it's a great age, believe me. But I don't think Maruf's age is helping because Indonesia is a very young electorate. Sandy Uno is very popular with the young people. He's very popular with the female crowd. So I think he's a real asset to Prabowo's ticket. But I don't think, but if you look at the polls, they haven't moved the needle. The polls have not changed significantly since before when they were named or after they were named. I think the more interesting dynamic, and one reason that Jokowi chose Maruf rather than a younger person is because his coalition blocked him. They assumed that the vice president, because this will be Jokowi's last term if he wins, the vice president would have a leg up in the next election. And they didn't want a younger person who might be a candidate. I think we can assume that Maruf will not be a candidate in 2024. Au contraire for Sandy Uno. win or lose, this is a tremendous brand building exercise for him. He has become, from vice mayor of Jakarta, a truly thankless position, I guarantee you, very difficult to look good in that position, to a national figure, so, and with aspirations for 2024. And in my view, he's just the kind of Indonesian, young Indonesian that we hope runs for office. He is a very committed person, a very good person, as the other candidates are, but I just say that because to me, the exciting part of this election is what it means for 2024. And that's the thing, the day this election ends, I'm going to be looking at 2024 because what's going to happen with conservative Muslim groups, as I mentioned, what's going to happen with people like Sandy Uno, what's going to happen with Anies Baswedan, another very charismatic young man, and so on and so forth. So I think Jokowi rocked the system. He is the first true outsider to run Jakarta, run Indonesia, I should say. And that's one reason a lot of the elite don't like him, because he's not one of them. So he came from the outside because of the new democratic Indonesia. He came from nowhere in the political scene. And we don't know who's going to come up in the next 5 years. We have the governor of West Java. That's a 50 million population province. He won that election. He's automatically a contender for 2024, Ridwan Kamil. The governors of Central and East Java, also very big provinces, people to look at. But the one who's getting the brand building now is Sandiaga Uno. So I'm like this, Andy will say, I forgot the question, but there's my answer, so I'll stop there.
Yeah, I think the running mate may have little impact on the outcome of the election, but in a closely contested race, it may be actually be important. In 2014, the margin was only 5%, and I think the contribution of Yusuf Kala was important in making sure that actually Jokowi eventually win. So this is going to, if we're going to have a close race again in this year, the choice of running mate may turn out to be important if the margin is so close. And on the question of the elected vice president, we should not discount Ma'ruf completely. He said, Mahathir got elected, huh? So why not me? He's only 74. So there are questions about, of course, everybody is now thinking, most people are already thinking about 2024. This election for most people is already a foregone conclusion, and therefore many of the candidates, many of the presidential wannabes in 2024 are already preparing themselves. I think Sandiaga Uno is well positioned, irrespective of whether he wins or not, but he's already made his mark that he is a viable candidate. I'm sure he's going to run again in 2024. But there will be a whole of other young politicians, ambitious. They already made the public known about their ambitions about 2024. And they're going to be looking for positions in the cabinet or in local government as governors in the next few years, to be able to promote themselves and show them to the public that they are a good candidate. So vice presidential position is one, but there are other positions where people can actually lift themselves up to be a viable or strong candidate for 2024. The position of vice president, there were concerns that if Ma'ruf is elected, and then he's going to have his own agenda different from Jokowi because he had been part of the 212 movement. He's come from the conservative groups of Muslims. And there were people saying that, well, if he's going to be vice president, he's going to influence Jokowi's policy, and that is going to be termed to be very Islamic. But if you look at the record of Jokowi and Yusuf Kala partnership, Yusuf Kala came into the job with a very strong track record. He had been vice president under Yudhoyono. He had led the Golkar party. So he came across as a very powerful and influential vice president. But look what happened in 2014 after the election. For the first 2 years, he was not given any job by Jokowi. So Jokowi decides what the vice president can and cannot do. And in the first 2 years, I remember Yusuf Kala was just traveling abroad, sent away by Jokowi. You know, you go to these countries. And one friend of mine who traveled with Yusuf Kala recalled in one of the trips to Europe, Yusuf Kala decided to extend his stay in Europe by 2 days because if I go home, I have nothing to do. He only came back become a useful vice president after the 212 movement, when there was a movement during the Jakarta governor elections, and I think there were questions about Jokowi's Islamic credentials. And I think Yusuf Kala, because of his background with Nahdlatul Ulama, and he helped to build the Islamic credentials of Jokowi. My point is that the power of the vice president is going to be decided by the president, and that's the extent of the influence that Ma'ruf will have. So I'm not concerned that with Ma'ruf, then he will influence Jokowi, going by the history of Yusuf Kala's vice presidency.
Okay, James, you got to answer the question on the economy.
On the FDI, yeah. I think, if I understand it, I look at it in there's two aspects here. One is FDI related to infrastructure, and one is FDI related to other sectors, manufacturing and more general private sector activity. Both camps have talked about the need or the recognition that state-owned enterprises can't continue to carry the load themselves. So they are very eager to try and expand public-private partnerships. So there should be, whoever's elected, there should be more opportunities in public-private partnership if the government, in the fact, can accept a reduced role for SOEs. In principle, they say they do. In fact, they don't. So we'll have to see if the new government does that. Also on FDI, I don't know what Prabowo will do, but on the negative list, the DNI, the infamous negative investment list, it's quite clear. There's no doubt about what the rules are. They're just not very attractive. Now, as I say, Jokowi recently, his government promulgated a mild liberalization in this sector. He backed off. After the election, he may do it again and not back off because it's not an election time. Many of us were surprised he tried it in an election time, but he did. So I suspect if he does win the election, we will see this in the next 6 months come out. Now, one thing to be aware of is the long lame duck period in Indonesia. The election's in April. Parliament takes office on October 1st, and the presidency on October 18th or 20th. The reason for that long period is in case there was a runoff for the presidency. There won't be, there's just two candidates. Under a very weird situation, it could be, but it's not going to happen. So, but we did have that in the first SBY election when he had a runoff against Megawati and won. So there's a long lame duck period. And that, if Jokowi wins, we'll probably see a cabinet reshuffle very quickly and the new government will take off, still dealing with the old parliament. And then the new government comes in October. So I suspect very quickly thereafter, if Jokowi wins, we'll see some changes. If Prabowo wins, we're going to have this very long lame duck period. And so that's a period of a little bit of uncertainty. The new government comes in with a budget passed by the old parliament. So the new government doesn't even have control of its first budget. So there are some complexities in the system that I guess work against rapid change.
So basically, we are looking forward to 2024 in that context. And it will be quite interesting because if the Gerindra party does well, and we haven't talked too much about party politics, that may be interesting because it throws up the possibility of Prabowo's side providing potential candidates for the 2024 election that shifts the balance somewhat. And of course, we do hope that Indonesia moves away from this inward-looking trajectory and becomes more open to foreign direct investment. Other aspects to bear in mind is the whole issue of the economy and how the economy could be decisive in the overall outcome of the 2019 elections. And with that, please join me in thanking our two presenters, Pak James, Pak Andi, for superb presentations.